Right, good morning everyone. Welcome to the third in our Third Sector Digital Leaders webinar series. We're delighted today to be joined by Chris Willis Pickup of Taylor Vinters. He's going to be talking about risk and what to do when digital goes wrong. One of these webinars before, you'll know, just feel free to type questions using either the chat box or the question and answer box, and we'll do our best to get through as many as you can. Other than that, I'm going to hand over to our host, Zoe Amar of Zoe Amar Digital. Zoe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Delighted to be here this morning to talk about the thorny subject of when digital goes wrong. And I can think of a few people who would be better to guide us through the maze of risk and digital than Chris Willis Pickup. He's a partner at Taylor Vinters, specialising in charities. So we're very much looking forward to hearing from Chris about that. Before Chris worked at Taylor Vinters, he was also at the Charity Commission as well. So he's got a wealth of experience in helping charities through the minefield that is charities and digital. So we're looking forward to touching on all of those issues today. We're going to begin with Chris taking us through some of the sort of key three things that he's learned about charities and managing risks in digital. So Chris, if you'd like to say a quick hello and then get into the presentation, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Dave. It's what an introduction. I hope that I can do justice to that in the next 45 minutes or so. And as you say, I have a sort of mixed background, partly from being a lawyer and partly from working at the charity regulator. So seeing lots of different regulatory things, and also how the Commission itself developed new digital services and went through its own digital transformation program. So I won't name names, but some of the stories I might tell in the next 45 minutes might come from the Charity Commission, and we'll see where we get to. So we're going to start with top three topics, tips on this topic of when digital goes wrong. So, and I think the first one of those to say is actually the hardest thing in managing risk in digital projects is knowing when something is actually going wrong, because these are quite free-flowing projects typically when you're making some sort of digital change or building a digital service, and actually there's a lot of exploration and you're doing something new, you're creating a new product, and it's hard to know what's just testing things out, you know, a necessary one step backwards to take two steps forwards, and what's a real problem that needs to be kind of gripped and dealt with now. So I'd say first up, that's probably the hardest thing to get right. And then typically, in my experience, the most costly problems for charities involve either data in some form, personal data or other sorts of data, and IT supplier contracts. And often it's both of those combined that cause the most expensive problems. And we'll talk about ways of mitigating that risk a little bit later on, I think. But more generally, the most important risk mitigation techniques for digital projects, in my view, are not anything technical, they're not anything particularly legal, and they're things that all digital leaders can do. And they are fundamentally about planning and listening. And planning is something that can take a back seat, particularly in some agile project development, but allowing time to plan and think about what the likely risks are, and then listening to everyone around you at all levels, all different stakeholders, so you get the widest possible range of input on what might happen and what could be done to sort things out. So those are my top tips.
I think that's so sensible, Chris. Thank you very much for breaking that down for us and making it manageable, because whenever I talk to charity leaders and also to boards and CEOs, you know, they're often so nervous about this incredibly complex, fast moving picture of how they manage risk in all of these projects. And of course, I guess you must see that a lot from the sharp end as well.
Yeah.
And what do you see as some of the biggest risks facing the sector at the moment in how charities are getting to grips with this digital stuff?
Sure. So I'd say, I mean, with a legal hat on, it often does come down to the terms and conditions that people sign. And I think that one of the challenges there is that there can be a bit of a mismatch between the sort of friendly suppliers, you know, helping the charity sector to build great things, and then actually what's in writing behind the scenes and the rights that those suppliers gain and can insist on later, can be a total mismatch. So I've seen some of the most one-sided IT supplier contracts offered to charities, and maybe in the hope that charities won't really look at them or check them or ask questions. And I've seen charities sign up to those and then have real problems down the line, not having access to a website anymore, or not being able to pull out supporter data because actually the contract says that's owned by the company. So I'd say that's with a legal hat on, that's one of the biggest risks in the sector. And one thing that's sort of linked to that is this concept of total cost of ownership. So when you're looking at the quote, typically that is obviously going to be as sweetened as possible, and the upfront costs are going to be minimized to make it look as attractive as possible. And sometimes it doesn't really explain what is the cost of it over the whole project. What's the cost of ownership? Now, as you would get with a mortgage, what are you actually paying over the whole term of the mortgage? What fees would you have to pay to exit? Are there administration fees on top? The kind of key information summary you get with a mortgage these days, you don't get with a supplier quote. But those are the similar sort of questions you should be asking. So that's supply contracts. I mean, the other big area that causes sort of risk and costs to charities and digital projects is actually people. Whether that's consultants that have been brought in and managing them and their costs, or actually your existing staff, because we've talked before, Zoe, about different types of digital projects, but the one that is most wide-ranging, a full digital transformation of your charity will involve your existing staff having to do different things, learn new skills, and invariably some people will respond really well to that, and some won't. And you're possibly looking at staff restructuring at that point, and that can be something that it doesn't need to be complicated, but it is quite easy to get it wrong.
Absolutely, and there are so many different aspects to this, aren't there? So as you say, there's this sort of employment law aspect, and this of HR as much as obviously the data and the supplier contracts as well, and making sure we're very clear on what you're signed up to, and obviously the development costs, which I think charities can sometimes underestimate for the future iterations. So there's a lot there on charity leaders' shoulders, isn't there, as they get into these projects. How do you think they can best anticipate those risks?
So I think the easiest way to talk about that is to go back to those kind of two techniques I mentioned at the beginning, or obvious things, planning and listening. And so one of the things we were talking about when we had a conversation about digital and a session with the digital leaders in London last week was, what are the 4 simple questions you can ask to try and identify legal risks? And I tried to make them really simple, hopefully not patronizingly simple. But what can go wrong? Well, the first thing is what you're trying to do just doesn't work. So how can you identify risks of it not working? The second one we spent quite a long time talking about, I think, is that people are cross. Whether that's the staff, whether that's your beneficiaries, whether that's your trustees, whether that's the public donating money to you, or someone else in wider society. A really common one is just that it costs a lot more than you expected, either in financial terms, or actually just because it costs a lot more staff time. You need to step in as a leader, or you need to pull people away from other things and get them involved in this project to make it happen. All of that's a cost of some sort. And the last one was mainly a regulatory issue about not being allowed to do it. So, planning, what are the legal hurdles and regulatory hurdles? As a charity, you've got restricted purposes. Are you allowed to do this? Does it fulfill your purposes? Is what you want to do with the data allowed? Charities actually have some slightly more restrictions in some cases than other organisations. So your supplier may not know those rules. And doing all of that in a kind of agile context, I think, is a real challenge, because it is a positive environment. Typically, you've got people who can be quite evangelical about developing these products, and it's quite hard as a leader to be the one who says, hang on a moment, let's just plan this out a little bit. Let's just pause building that front end that looks so great, and talk a little bit about the back end, or think about what the risks might be. But a little building in planning time into your project plans is the best way to create space for that. And then listening was the other thing. And I think, as I said before, really, the widest range of people you can listen to, the better. And I've seen so many digital projects done almost in a vacuum. And even though agile project development is designed to avoid a kind of this waterfall moment of just delivering the project to the business, actually in practice, although you might be pulling in people with different skills, although it might be iterative development, actually that can all still happen in a bubble. And for the rest of the business, the rest of the organization, it still looks like you're just being presented with a fait accompli. And actually that's where there can be a real mismatch in terms of what the product is set up to do and how it works and whether it's sustainable. So bringing in as many people as possible, maybe not just through the sort of show and tell process in agile development, maybe just actually talk to some people who don't want to come and see the product, who are the skeptics, because they probably have something useful to share as well.
I think that's such a good idea. So really making sure that you've got all your key stakeholders involved, and then thinking about what point at which they need to get involved as well, so they feel they've played a meaningful part in that. So I suppose that relates to my next question, actually, which is about the role that boards play in particularly digital transformation, because in my experience sometimes they see things quite late in the game. So do you think that's right? Do you think boards need to play a different kind of role in digital for charities? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's I've sort of seen it on both sides, I suppose. I've seen how boards have reacted, and also spoken to quite a lot of people running projects who don't feel they can go to their board. So I'd say from the running the project perspective, from the digital leaders perspective, I heard a lot of people say, if I go to my board, they'll stop us doing this. And that's quite worrying, actually, because if the people running the charity day to day think this will help further the purposes, and they don't even feel confident having the conversation with their board, then there's something really going wrong. And to be frank, that's going wrong at the board level. And one of the other areas, which I think we've talked about before actually as well, but one that worries me and is the focus of quite a lot of our conversations with boards at the moment, is about diversity and who's on boards. And I know you've been a great advocate, Zoe, of having digital trustees, which I think is an absolutely great way of pushing that. But in reality, all of the board should be open to this, willing to take risks and think about things, engage with the ideas. And actually, if you're a digital leader and you're at the point of saying, I don't think I can trust my board to provide sensible input, well, that's probably not just a digital problem. That's probably a genuine governance problem for your board. And you have my sympathies, and I'm afraid you're not alone. That's what all the research is showing, is that there is a lack of diversity of thought on boards, actually, as much as diversity of backgrounds. But there is an opportunity here, I would say, with digital projects and Zoe's digital trustee initiative to get some fresh thinking onto the board. And actually, if you sometimes the boards react much better than people expect. They're in maybe a bit of a rut, the board, and they don't really know how to add value and approach the right way. A digital project is a great way potentially to re-energize your board, remind them why they're passionate about the mission that you're all trying to achieve together. And so it can be a real catalyst to much better governance and board engagement. The other side is what is the board's role, and how should the board see this? I think there are two parts of that. One of them is that really the board's there to provide strategic oversight, so that someone is keeping the overall picture in mind, while everyone else is kind of doing the day-to-day building and focusing on solving the day-to-day issues. Actually a board or a subcommittee of a board can be a really helpful group to be asking some of the sort of strategic questions. How is this furthering our purposes? If in a digital project we only do the top 80%, are we still having enough impact to make this worth doing? Just because these things, the other 20% are difficult, actually maybe those are the ones that have real impact and we should be doing those instead. What's next? How does this fit into the overall strategy for the charity? How does this fit the other plans that maybe the digital team knows about, maybe they don't? And what's our plan B? What does happen if it fails or doesn't have the success we hope for? What are we going to do instead? So I do think the board can ask those useful strategic questions, as they would with really any project. Where I think your digital trustee idea kind of adds to that is that when you're doing something new like this kind of digital project, and you don't have existing skills in the organization or expertise, actually you can get that in very cheaply at the board level. And just to be really clear, it's not about getting a digital consultant as a board member and then getting them to do your digital project, but it's about having someone who understands the context, can ask the right questions, and maybe can offer you their networks as well. So going out and finding the right suppliers, possibly finding some external consultants. Well, someone who does that day to day, either in charities or in the commercial world, will have a network of contacts that can be really helpful to help charities get started. So I would say that that can be a real benefit, to have someone who knows the ropes and has done it before, when you don't have that within your existing staff.
think that's a really good idea. So making sure that you've got some digital skills on your board, and also where that those skills need to be a bit more widespread across the board itself to make some really informed decisions about this stuff. So I think that's such a good point. And if you have a board and indeed your senior management team, you're at the start of this process, perhaps if you're looking at doing a big digital transformation project, and then you're looking at managing all those multiple risks at the beginning of the project, and then also thinking about how you can set up a bit of a process to do that as the project progresses. What do you think is a good way to do that?
Sure. So I think it can be quite daunting at that first point, you know, embarking on this new project with all these sort of risks, and people like, you know, me saying there's all these different risks that can come up and pitfalls and new things you need to learn. But one thing I would say about risk is it is just an inherent part of any digital project. And, you know, you're not really changing anything if you're not creating some risk. And you know, the biggest opportunities to have greater impact tend to come with the biggest risks. So, you know, it is a slight leap of faith. And you know, I would sort of commend digital leaders for looking at that and being encouraged to transform their charities. So I think there will be risks, and it's important to kind of accept that. And actually, there will be risks that you can't mitigate, and that's completely fine. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go ahead, but it also doesn't mean that looking at them, understanding them, and talking about them isn't important. So I think the next point really is within that risk range is understanding that there are different types of risks. So typically the way that we look at risks, and lots of people will be familiar with this, is to see first how likely are these risks to occur. And some risks are much more likely to happen than others. And then if they do happen, well, what's the impact? You know, some risks, well, the impact's not that big. You know, it could be a small impact, a small delay of a couple of weeks. It could be a huge impact. It could be, you know, losing your fundraising because you've lost other people's sensitive data. And weighing up, I think one of the challenges is weighing up the likelihood, balancing that with the impact, and working out which risks are the most important ones to focus on, because it is a combination of those things. And you can, I mean, happily, you can just download a matrix that will help you do that. There's plenty of systems out there to kind of rate these risks and make these judgments. And that can be really helpful when you're starting out and you just have a sense that these general risks, you know, that's the next step. Let's measure those risks. Let's make a judgment. Won't be perfect, but that's fine. At least, you know, you have a priority list then, and that's the first step. So I think then there's not really any particular magic about how you identify risks. So once you've written down the stuff that's sort of in your head that you're worrying about, and got that down on paper, to really kind of build that out, I would say I don't think you can really go and download that, I'm afraid. I think the risks are specific to individual charities and specific to individual projects, but I do think people have all the resources available to them to work it out. It's just a question of asking the right questions. And the basic questions are all what-if questions. So, you know, what if a key person leaves? You know, what if a supply goes bust? What if there are cost overruns? You know, what if you do something that alienates your supporters? What if you switch a service away from beneficiaries and it doesn't work for them? You know, what's the plan B there? And so I think if you just asking some of those basic questions, again, with the widest group of people you can, and maybe with the flowchart, in a room at the beginning, what are people worried about? What do we do in these situations? And just accept that that's not about coming up with the answers. The first stage is to identify the risks. And then once you've got those down on paper, you can start thinking about ways of mitigating those, starting with the highest priority risks.
I think that's such a good idea to have that conversation about risk right at the start of the project, and then to get all of those fears and worries out of people's heads onto paper, and then think about how you can practically manage them. So we do this thing with clients sometimes called a pre-mortem, where we get them to imagine it's a 12
morbid,
months down the line. Very morbid, but it's quite a constructive thing. And so we get them to think about what are the worst things that could happen, and then 12 months down the line, what are these things, and then how can we work backwards from that to mitigate them. And that can be quite useful in helping people just start identifying them, because risk in itself is such a loaded thing to get people to discuss, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the ways you can start to decide about mitigation actions, I suppose, the next phase. I mean, you've got your risks, you've assessed them, you prioritize them, you're then thinking about mitigating. Well, you know, lots of the ways of mitigating risks involve doing less or doing something differently, and a lot of those will reduce the impact potentially, because you're reaching for a smaller opportunity. And actually, that's where the opportunity and risk elements come together. So, you know, that actually when you're deciding on those mitigation actions, there's all sorts of things you can do. You know, you can spend lots of money on legal review, but you haven't got that money to spend on your beneficiaries anymore. So there are always pros and cons to the mitigation steps, and you shouldn't necessarily spend that time and effort on mitigating if you can spend the time and effort better somewhere else. So I think it's important to keep the strategic aims in mind when you're looking at that risk discussion, and I think that can really help turn it into a positive and productive discussion rather than something that is negative. And hopefully people come out of that energized and feel able to be more confident about judging risk and reporting concerns that they have, and know that, you know, in this hopefully positive digital kind of culture, people will take that on as a positive step and part of the iteration of the development of the product.
I think that's such a good idea to bring it back to your strategy as well, and the key priorities for your charity. So speaking of that, you know, so imagine we are in this really difficult situation when something does go wrong, particularly something quite big. So what is the first thing charity leaders should do when that happens?
The absolute first thing I do is I'd probably put the phone down and then go for a walk outside, because I think there's rarely anything you can do in the first 10 minutes after you've heard about a problem without, and generally take that 10 minutes, go and get some fresh air, come back with a clear head. That's the top tip I have, I think, because actually you're the leader. People are going to be looking to you to have a clear head and be calm. To be resilient for everyone else's sake. I mean, whatever's going on behind the scenes, I think it's important to be able to project that calmness and control, and everyone will calm down and make better judgments in that context. So once you've got a clear head, I think the question then in crisis management comes down to people. So what is the team you need around you to fix this problem? And I would focus on people you trust to work well in a crisis. So I wouldn't look at the org chart. I wouldn't look at you know, who you think's got the right authority, or, you know, nominally on paper has the right skills to deal with this kind of stuff. Because typically with digital projects, you're dealing with new things, and with problems in digital projects, you're dealing with really new things that no one in the organization knows about, so or has that much experience of. So I would reach out to the people who spring to mind, the ones you think you can trust to come and help. They could be at all levels of the organization. And then I would think, you know, as you have your charity to keep running, how are you going to fill those gaps and keep services running while you pull those people out for a time to try and fix the digital problem? And so once you've pulled that team out, I suppose looking at the skills, you know, to help people formalize that a little bit. Now, what do you actually need to manage a crisis of some sort? Well, the most important thing in my view is sort of analytical skills. So someone who can clearly see through the information that you've got, what information you might be missing, distinguish between what you know is certain and what is uncertain and may change, and people who are then able to think strategically about different scenarios. So what could happen next? Because I think, unfortunately, in my experience, the initial problem in a digital project that you come up against, or people raise with you, is sometimes the tip of the iceberg, and sometimes it's just an indicator, and actually the real problems are something else. You know, this is just a symptom, and you need to be able to find the cause. So people who are kind of able to think strategically about risk in that way would be very helpful. I wouldn't underestimate the value of having the right communications person involved at that stage, not because you want to kind of whitewash the problems or anything like that, but because usually the people with the analytical skills are not the best people to then communicate with your staff, with your beneficiaries, with wider stakeholders. But I think the combination of those two can be really powerful. And I think then it comes down to leadership and resilience. And I think I would say to digital leaders, don't take all of that upon yourselves. You know, you've got a wider leadership role typically, and a sort of need to keep everything else going. So pick someone who you think will be a really good leader, not because they have project management skills, but because they are resilient and inspirational, and put them in charge of the kind of crisis project. And so that you can just take a step back from it and not do everything day to day. And you can just keep an eye on a bit of an oversight role, and you have someone you trust to be running that day to day. So I think those are my, once you know something's gone wrong, that's what I would do.
A very good practical plan. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
So thank you very much for that. I think we're now going to move into some questions. So if you have some questions for Chris, please do type them into the box, and then we will ask Chris those questions for you.
Chris, just to kick things off, got a question here about resources, and is there any guidance available that you're aware of to support charities, firstly when they're considering risk, and then secondly if something does go wrong? I mean, what sort of external support, free support, can people turn to?
Sure. So on risk management generally, there's quite a lot of resources about general risk management. So there is some basic guidance on the Charity Commission website. That's useful for knowing what's the legal framework. One thing to look at when you're thinking about the regulator, if you're a registered charity, is serious incident reporting. It's got an updated regime recently, but it's something that it's worth mentioning because you're now expected to report incidents to the regulator, and actually you can find that they give you quite a lot of support if you do. So looking at that, new serious incident guidance there would be useful. There's an Institute of Risk Management Professionals. They have really useful matrices to kind of download if you want to build a risk register, which is the kind of document I was talking about before where you're measuring risks and putting mitigation actions. There are plenty of examples out there. In practical terms, one of the things I've done with charities is actually look at the annual reports of other charities, particularly those in your field who do similar things to you, whether that's providing services, whether that's doing research, whether that's public fundraising. There is a risk section in most good trustee annual reports, and it often includes the structures of how people manage risk. So having a look at those, they're all on the Charity Commission's website. You can search their register by type of service. You can search it even by kind of purposes, and so if you can find some charities that match you, or maybe a slightly broader definition of you, you'll find quite a lot of useful information from their annual reports. And the next stage beyond that is actually then just to get in touch with those charities, because actually I've found it's a wonderful sector for collaboration. So if you're wondering about a risk register, why not get in touch with them and ask if you can see theirs? And generally people have been really positive about sharing that. And some of the most useful conversations I've seen have been between peers who are trying to deal with risk or digital projects in different organizations, whether that's through a program like the Digital Leaders or just from getting in touch with people and asking for a coffee. In terms of when digital goes wrong, I haven't seen a lot out there, I'm afraid. And partly that's why we're having this webinar series, and partly why I've been talking to Zoe about actually us, Taylor Vinters, writing something, because there does seem to be a bit of a gap out there with some of the content of this webinar and some of the content of the session we did for Digital Leaders last week. So as and when I can get enough time free, I am planning to write something and stick it out there on the internet and possibly link to the Charity Digital Code. So hopefully people can be patient and have a look at that, but that should be designed specifically for digital risks for charities at least.
I think that sounds great, actually, and if I can be a sounding board on that, Chris, please let me know. It sounds like a very useful resource. I've got another question, actually. So I was talking to someone who is, a bit of a rising star in the sector, I won't name, but is kind of going up the ladders of becoming more senior. What do you think is a good way for someone at that level who may work in digital to learn about risk?
Sure. So I think the real benefit that person's going to have is sort of good experience with digital projects. So they probably got a lot of really practical experience that they can reflect on. So one of the things I'd say for someone like that is think about how you can look at your own experience in a different way. And that might even be something like coaching. Can you find a coach who has some experience in that field of managing risk and can help you to draw out kind of in conversation what you already know? So I think that's one suggestion. The other one is that I think there's possibly a bit of a gap in terms of events within the charity sector for looking at risk, particularly risk in digital projects. It's quite easy to find, legal briefing seminars, things like that, and even stuff on risks generally. But I think, again, there's translating that to digital projects is a challenge. There is quite a lot more out there beyond the charity sector, because obviously digital projects are widespread across all different sectors. So I think looking at some of the major accounting firms and some of the major consultancy firms, these sort of Boston Consulting or KPMG people like that, a lot of them have digital resources available free, and digital webinars, digital sessions, and some of those are about risk. So I would think for those people who are rising up like that, look outside the charity sector for now, and then bring that back and share it with everyone in the charity sector, because it will be a real benefit for everyone else.
That's really excellent guidance. Thank you, Chris. And another resource I'd add to that very helpful list is McKinsey have a whole ton of content on McKinsey Digital, and they're brilliant at articles, things like 10 things that can go wrong in your digital transformation. So you're right. I think looking outside the sector can be a really good place, actually.
Yeah.
Chris, I've got another question here about procurement. And so I think you touched on this very briefly, but the charity sector is awash with stories of people contracting the wrong website supplier and IT systems. And I wonder what tips you can give to someone who might be commissioning a new website. What should they be looking for in a good and trusted supplier?
Sure. So start with three things, I suppose. One of them is if you're asking for people to quote, I would ask them for their terms and conditions at the same time as the price. So, I think the way that the supplier would rather do it is give you a price and a pretty vague scope of work and get you to agree it, and then you get a heavy legal document after that you basically, it looks like you just have to sign it or not. If you ask them for the terms at the time that they're quoting, then they'll give you the best terms they can make available. And it doesn't seem that widely known, but suppliers often have different versions of their terms. We as lawyers, when we work with IT suppliers, we are often asked to produce different versions or to produce a kind of manual for how they can amend them to respond to their customers' requests. So just because that's, you're sent a PDF document with terms in, it doesn't mean it can't be changed. So, the Word document's behind there somewhere. They might well have a different version of it. They might well have one of the sort of guides that we produce that tells you what you can change. But if you ask for that set of terms at the point that they are bidding and competing for the contract, and you make clear that the terms of business are part of your decision making, then that's probably the easiest way to get better terms without having to go through a detailed negotiation of them. So that's, I think, first point. The second point is now, as we all do now when we're looking at buying something or booking a hotel, there's quite a lot of information out there from other people who've used them. And as you say, there are stories that abound. And generally, there's sort of no smoke without fire. So if there are a lot of stories out there, then it is worth paying attention to some of them and making sure you have some suppliers on your shortlist that are recommended. And I think one of the challenges for people doing procurement is how do you translate a sort of rumor in the sector into something you can take to decision makers and ultimately maybe your finance team and say, we're going to pay more for this website because we don't trust this supplier that's given us the lowest quote. And that can be quite difficult. So if you can get kind of, maybe try and formalize that a little bit, you can ask for testimonials from people. You can ask suppliers to give you referees who you can phone up and ask them about the experience. And if they won't do that, that's usually a bad sign. There are some really good networks out there. I know I'm on a WhatsApp group that's Third Sector Geeks, which I think Zoe's on as well. And that is, people offer recommendations daily on that for how to do things and which suppliers to use. And people also say, well, watch out for these ones. And so that's a really valuable network, and it's really easy to use that. I'm sure they must exist on other platforms as well. And I can't remember what the third thing was on procurement, I'm afraid. If it comes back to me, I'll say it in a few minutes.
I've got a question here actually, which is related to that one. So suppose you're a smaller charity and you're in that process of procurement, but sadly you can't afford the great services of someone like yourself, Chris, and then you've got this 50-page contract from an IT supplier. Where do you start? What can you do?
So I'd say that if you start reading it and it doesn't make any sense at all, that's generally not a good sign. Contracts can be written in plain English. They don't have to be full of jargon or almost unreadable in terms of their grammar. So probably if it's impenetrable in 50 pages, it's not designed for you to understand. And that's usually a bit of a red flag. It might be that you just have to go with that supplier and then maybe recommendations and talking to other people about their practical experiences is helpful. But if you've got other options and the terms are much clearer and simpler, that should be a factor in your decision making. And then I'd say it's about don't be afraid to ask basic questions. No, it's the supplier's terms. They should understand them and be able to explain them. And if the person you're talking to, which may be a salesperson or a development person, if they can't answer the questions, then that suggests a problem as well. If they don't understand their own terms, and they have to go back to their lawyers or their procurement team to try and understand and answer just basic questions, that's probably a bit of a red flag that that person you're talking to doesn't really understand the service they're selling. And I think in terms of basic questions, first one, total cost of ownership. What you can just say, what is the total cost to me of the whole of this project? And you might get a fairly garbled answer, but you can certainly ask the question. And what happens if what are the scenarios you're worried about? What happens if we change our mind and we want to terminate, and we want to stop paying you in 6 months? Or what happens if we want to change our needs in 6 months? How does that happen? There's some of the slightly more technical things where people fall down is about integration into existing systems. So the basic question there is, does this cover integrating your solution with our existing systems? And if it doesn't, that will make a big difference to the cost. And if it does cover it, are there any limits on that? Are you only allowing a certain amount of time for that? And if it goes over it, we have to pay more. Testing is another slightly more technical one. Does this proposal include testing? And how much testing does it include? What expectations do you have for us as a charity helping you with that testing? Because it can be quite common for them to say, right, we need 10 people to do 10 hours of testing each. And actually that's 100 hours you've lost staff members from their day-to-day stuff, whereas other people will be able to do a lot more of the testing themselves. So I think anything you don't understand, feel free to ask, and think about the risks that worry you and ask them what the contract means. What's the impact of the contract on those questions, and don't worry too much about quoting clause numbers and things like that back at them. Just ask them the basic questions, and if they can't answer it, then think about other options.
Thank you. That's very practical advice. Dave, are there any other questions? Dave?
There aren't, no, and my internet connection has suddenly gone extremely shaky. So I'm struggling actually to hear what you're both saying, which is typical for a webinar called When Digital Goes Wrong. Hopefully, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yeah, we can.
Very good.
A good worked example of unpredictable things in digital age.
Well, perhaps on that note...
I'm cutting in and out. Zoe, I might leave it to you to wrap up if that's okay.
Okay, yes, of course. So I think on that note, before anything goes really wrong with the internet, I think we are extremely grateful to Chris for sharing so many useful, very practical insights, and particularly for explaining them all in such an understandable way. So Chris, thank you. We're extremely grateful for your time, and I hope everyone's found this as useful and enjoyable as I have.
Thank you, Zoe. I've actually just seen someone's flagged up on the chat and said they've got a question, so I don't know whether we still have time to see that question.
Yes, definitely.
If they want to type it in the chat, that might be the easiest way for us all to see it.
Oh, now that is a very, very good question. Can you see that?
I can see that question, yeah. So is there any way of mitigating risks of bringing people in-house as opposed to contractors? So I think, is that about, does bringing people in-house help? Or is it about kind of concerns about when you bring people in-house, what risks do you create? And maybe the easiest thing is, yeah, okay, I think we've got a yes for the first one, but I might answer both. We'll see in case anyone else is interested. So they're bringing people in-house. Well, in terms of mitigating risks, yes, that can be really helpful. And what you're trying to balance there is having the right skills at the right cost within the organisation. In practical terms, if you want to get someone really good, but you can only offer them a 6-month contract, that might not be attractive for them. So you sometimes can struggle to bring the right people in-house. And if they're really key to delivering your project, and you're not getting the right person or the best person out there, that can be a real problem. And sometimes it's better to go with a consultancy option that might look a bit more expensive, but is a much better quality outcome. Because often these projects do depend hugely on the skills of the individual people involved. If you're thinking about a long-term role, so more at the kind of running a digital service ultimately, then I think it's really valuable to have people in-house from the beginning, because and this is something where I can give an example from my regulatory experience. The most effective digital services the Charity Commission built were the ones that were led by their existing staff, because they understood their context, they understood the needs of the Charity Commission's kind of customers, and they understood how all the existing legacy systems worked, because they'd had to sort of struggle with them for years. And the consultants that came in didn't really understand either of those things. And consultants, to be frank, made a lot slower progress, and they produced something that looked great, but was much less effective than when the staff got involved and said, okay, we don't have to have it this complicated, but what would be really useful in practice if it did these things. So, and what's the real benefit of that? Well, the same staff are still at the Charity Commission running those services now. So they built them, they run them, they iterate them to improve them, and they're now using their skills that they developed in those processes to build new ones. And so that's a really good example of when it works really well. But I think if you need, just to summarize, if you need the really specific skills coming in, do think about consultancy, because sometimes you can't buy that in effectively on a short-term contract. If you want someone to build and run a service for the future, yeah, do bring them in-house. That's a good idea. So in terms of mitigating risks of having people in-house, well, the main risk is a cost risk. It's mainly that you find you haven't got the right person, and you want or need to let them go, or you've brought someone in on a long-term contract or a permanent contract, and actually the strategic context or needs or funding position changes, and you can't afford them anymore. And I think it's probably fairly widely accepted among people working in digital that actually you don't tend to end up with a permanent contract. Maybe in a 2-year contract is possibly a fair balance of those things. And so the best way of mitigating risk, I would say, and I don't like the idea of advocating shorter term contracts, but a 2-year contract, we're all trying something new. We've got to see how it develops. Feels like a fair balance to me. And that way, after you're committed for 2 years, you can budget for that, you can plan for that, even if funding's a bit tight. But you haven't got it, you're not stuck with a significant cost that all the way into the future.
That's such a great question, Layla. Thank you, and another very helpful answer there, Chris. I mean, there's so many other things to think through as well, aren't there, in terms of your recruitment process, the kind of cultural fit, and then also that accountability that you create as well, if someone's perhaps not a permanent member of staff, and indeed if they're a consultancy as well. So you're right, you need to, as you say, you need to look at this stuff in a very holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly we've got some examples I think we were talking about last week about when consultants come in and offend staff so much that they lose trust in your digital project. If they're sat at one desk that a long-running staff member has seen as their desk for 10 years, but they come in one morning to find there's a consultant sat there. And then later on that day, the consultant is sort of shouting at someone over the phone about the fact that their swimming pool is being built slowly and it needs to be finished because they're having a big party at the weekend. And that might sound ridiculous, but that's actually a true story. That's probably one of the most effective ways of losing your staff support for digital projects. So I think those practical things, where are they going to sit? Are they going to be in the same office as everyone else, or are they going to be a long way away? Are you having to move other staff away to give them space? And how are the staff going to feel about the digital project if you do that? And whatever their skills, are they people who are going to get on fine in the office? Are they going to be selling your digital project at the coffee machine, or are they going to be so abrasive that they put people off? And actually, those things are really important as well as the technical skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So screening for those as well. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Chris,
Well, I think
was the swimming pool completed in time for the party?
I think the consultant was no longer at the organisation by the time the swimming pool was due to be complete, because I think it had caused too many problems. But it was a symptom of other issues, I think, as well.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much, Chris. There's been such a practical kind of set of tips and strategies that people need to think about as part of how they identify and manage risk. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us this morning.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Worth just pointing out to all the participants, so we've got 2 further webinars scheduled. So we've got one next Tuesday late afternoon at 4:30, looking at the future of work. So looking at things like learning, blockchain, and how new technologies are going to affect charities in the workplace. And then on Wednesday at 10:30, we have a session on user insights. So Tori Alloway of CAST will be sharing some tips for how charities can start measuring and using data more effectively, particularly on a budget as well. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for those. Other than that, I think it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Lovely. Thanks
you
all.
everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
Bye.